The principle of rhythm is one of the more commonsensical principles of Hermeticism, and it can be derived directly from vibration. As states in the Kybalion, it simply says, quote, "Everything flows out and in. Everything has its tides. All things rise and fall. The swing manifests in everything. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. Rhythm compensates." End quote. The viewer is probably already well familiar with this as day-to-day life carries. However, this is also built in the fundamental level of reality if the obvious consequence of the principle of vibration, which is really only the science of quantum mechanics as explained. As we will see along on the way, it is connected to the principle of polarity. Rhythm is also referred to in scientific terms as frequency, the rate at which the number of waves moves over a period of time. The connection to quantum mechanics is obvious here, as wave functions are of course waves, which by definition have their own vibratory frequency or rhythm. Thus, rhythm is built, at its most fundamental level, directly into vibration. To fully understand the principle of rhythm, however, we need to see how this also scales up from fundamental vibrations. Wave functions are described in terms of sine and cosines. Any combination of these sines and causes in turn comprises a larger waveform that is described as a Fourier series. Since everything including all particles and even space-time itself is described by wave functions, these wave functions would repeat on all scales and everything as Fourier series. Wave functions have crises and totus, though many were experienced minute and maxima. This would of course correspond to the tides and rises and falls described by Hermeticism that everything has. A waveform has a single frequency, however, and thus it should be curious that the Kybalion should describe it as connected with polarity, which deals with the decrease and increase of frequency along the scale. Quote, "Rhythm manifests between the two poles established by the principle of polarity. This does not mean, however, that the pendulum of rhythm swings to the extreme poles, for this rarely happens. In fact, it is difficult to establish the extreme polar opposites in the majority of cases, but the swing is ever toward first one pole and then the other." End quote. In the Fourier series, there are many waveforms superimposed over one another. Some of these waves are larger than others, and some others are smaller. The combined average frequency of the composite waveform they create is based on their collective energy. However, are there many waves of the many frequency comprising this waveform, this average frequency is also always evident and at all points of the waveform. For example, a trout of a very large waveform could appear, such that at a sufficiently limited scale it would appear as though the contribution of the waveform of that particular wave is negligible. Here, the remainder of the waveform in the pattern would become evident, and the contribution of the larger wave's energy would not be apparent. Thus, from the shorter span of the waveform, the average vibration of the waveform would be more diminished than that of the waveform on a whole. Since polarity is described in terms of changes in vibration, polarity would naturally rise and fall with the crest and troughs of a complex waveform. This would in turn correspond to a rise and fall in the mental states corresponding to such vibrations. The probability of mental states occurring would still be here though. However, since the probability in quantum mechanics of a state occurring is dependent upon the altitude of the wave function at any particular point, its chance of occurring would be diminished during such troughs. These wave functions, as they exist as part of the environment, are very tiny once the wave function has been collapsed. Prior to that, though, the environment would exist as such a giant waveform with its own rhythm, which could, in principle, as we will now see, last great spans of time. Despite being collapsed from the frame of the observer's environment, many resulting patterns and conscious or subconscious influences would continue to exist and be related to the rhythms of the environment's wave function from which they are produced or decomposed. In other words, rhythm literally is how decoherence takes place. A significant occult phenomena associated with the rhythm is the cycle of ages. This is the idea that the world travels through ages of time as if on a grand clock. The beginnings and endings of these ages correspond to the hidden but natural occult influences produced by these natural rhythms, which due to their mental nature and broad influence, and leave the materialist and the reductionist. Nevertheless, cycles of this nature do exist and have been observed and documented by many cultures. In the West, they are astrological ages. In the East, in India, they are the yugas, and in the Mayas, based on their Chucky calendar them. Not all of these refer to the same cycles, however, but they all do belong to the same concept, and it is possible to find links between them. Sometimes these cycles are associated with the zodiac, though this does not have any additional significance beyond the fact that observations of the heavens are useful in establishing the existence of yet more corresponding cycles of rises and falls. The last era of the Mayan calendar, which was just recently exited earlier this decade, illustrates an example of the cycles of ages at work. The Mayan long calendar is divided into 400 eras, and each of these eras has an associated theme. And the theme of the previous era, which lasted over the previous 4 centuries, from 1618 AD to 2012 AD, was that of the triumph of materialism and the transformation of matter. This was known about prior to any of the intellectual developments going on in Europe at the time, which since of the time of the Enlightenment has been increasingly materialistic in their thinking. In this case, the spiritual underpinning behind this development was clearly based and predicted by the cycles of ages recorded in the long calendar. This period of time and the prevalence of materialistic thinking and its consequences was predicated by other such cycles as well, sometimes with uncanny accuracy. Though this period has also produced many scientific and technological advancements, which has also benefited humanity, the underlying spiritual and intellectual framework in which it has done so has left humanity severely impoverished and nihilistic in many respects. These times correspond to an era of forgetting the true nature of reality. These two things, though, need not be associated with each other. As it has been previously described in this series, a scientific view of the world need not also be a materialistic view of the world, despite the common but false conflation between the two. So, it should be clear to the viewer that the rise of materialistic thinking is not merely an inevitable result of progress, but rather, it was the result of the spiritual influence of our age, which will in time subside. For the script of this video and many other concepts in this series, you can check out the Quantum Hermetica, where you will find more details regarding the Hermetic principles.